Welcome back. You are halfway through the Global Insurance Forum of 2022. My name is Denise Campbell, and I'm a Senior Vice President and Client Executive at Marsh. I'm also the President of the National African American Insurance Association New York chapter. I'm on the board for the Water Street Club, an organization that's catered towards diversity within the industry. And I'm on the board for the Insurance Federation of New York, where I serve as the liaison for the Emerging Leaders Advisory Council. So what do all these things that I do have to do with this panel? Could you guess it? We're going to be talking about inspiring inclusion, a leadership agenda, a really important topic and at the top of many of our companies' agendas at the moment. How can we inspire inclusion? To lead us through our conversation, we have Truett Tate, retired chairman of QBE North America, and he will be joined by panelists Tara Favors, executive vice president and chief executive vice president and chief human resources officer for Mutual of America. It's a lot of hats she's wearing. Sue Figueiredo Cook, Chief Operating Officer, Global Risk Solutions of Liberty Mutual, and Gian Power, founder and CEO of TLC Lions. Why is this so important today? We're going to explore how insurance aims to bring more diversity to boards and to leadership and how leaders can inspire inclusion. Leading CEOs recognize that inclusion helps shape the success of a company. And there are many ways that leaders can drive employee engagement. But among the most effective and impactful is promoting programs and initiatives that improves and increases diversity and inclusion. You heard that right. Among the most effective and impactful are those that are focused on diversity and inclusion. And today we face an inflection point when it comes to our employees. With the changing perceptions of what it means to work in an organization, compounded by the creation of a new normal of hybrid work, with many employees preferring to permanently work from home, this panel will explore tools we have to draw people back to the office, where physically being together increases productivity, improves happiness, and leads to better engagement. We'll also explore how a more diversified workforce enhances decision-making and increases success. We're going to examine best practices that have most impact on creating a more harmonious atmosphere. I think harmony is a really good term for us to think about here, right? We're not going to mute out any note. We're going to bring them all together. And as a music major from NYU, I'm excited to see how this panel brings that harmony together as we dive into how to inspire inclusion. I will now take this time to pass it on over to Truett. Take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Denise. And thanks to Josh Landau, to the IIS. I've got to admit, I think that they put on the very best conferences, whether it be virtual or in person. Relevant topics, great speakers, and I'm not being self-congratulatory, I promise, and a terrific mix of both. So I'm delighted to be a part of this, as I'm sure my panelists are as well. So turning to our little piece of the puzzle, my panelists and I are going to be exploring how insurers and indeed most all organizations, whether it be for profit or otherwise, can bring more diversity into the boards and indeed into all of leadership. How these leaders can inspire inclusiveness in their organizations, and in turn, how they can translate that into more successful organizations. So I love the goal. I hope you do. I love the connectivity. And indeed, we've got three panelists today who I think are probably the epitome of that connectedness, whether it be from the perspective of an entrepreneur who is promoting the power of storytelling as a method for making executive communications more effective, to a major corporate CHRO who must be change agent and champion and avatar all at once, to a COO who is translating that diversity into a more dynamic and effective operating company. They are all, let's call them modern architects of companies that have a soul, companies that more clearly represent the world we live in, companies that by tapping the broadest reach of skills, build cultures that attract the best talent, that create pride and satisfaction and loyalty. In these times of the intense battle for talent, building such enterprises has to be a priority for all of us. So let's dig in. Gian, let's start with you. Perhaps controversial, but then you're hardly known as someone who avoids a bit of controversy. I've heard you say, stop making the business case for diversity. My gosh, isn't that heresy? I mean, isn't that what everybody's been encouraged to do? You obviously have a perspective that I think this audience would love to hear. What do you mean by stop making the business case for diversity?
Well, thanks, Truett. And I know it sounds controversial, but I will explain my point, and it's great to be here. I think, look, we've all heard about the business case for diversity, I think, for so long. And hey, I think there was a time and a place for it, because as leaders, people needing to understand the relevance and the importance of it, perhaps there was a time when it was, when it hits our bottom line, we're going to get somebody's attention. But the fact is, times have changed, and they've changed quite rapidly over the last few years. And actually, a study recently backs up my argument, which is they did a bit of a study at Harvard Business Review, and it was a professor out of Yale Management School who wanted to look at, are we all getting it wrong? And what they did, they looked at all of the Fortune 500 companies, they looked on their websites, and what they saw is that there tended to be two types of website when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, there's the websites that just talk about the business case, why it's the right thing to do for business. Now, 80% of the organizations in the Fortune 500 fit into that case. Now, the other type is what they call the fairness case, or the moral case, or I like to call it the human case, of why it's just the right thing to do on a human basis. And anybody who can do the math can work out that the 15% they couldn't identify in either bucket. But what they did through it, they started to look at, okay, what does this do for underrepresented candidates? If they're going onto your website and they want to go for a role, they read the business case. In every single scenario, they found that it made them less likely to apply for the job when the organization made the business case rather than the moral case. And the point is, and why you might think it's actually what the interviewee said, is that they're going on, they now feel like an asset. They're going on there, and instead of it just being why is this right for business, it's, we value women or ethnic minorities in the business because it makes us a better business. Well, actually, people just want to feel a sense of belonging and feel like they care. And so actually just making a human case. So why do I say this? Because actually everything on our websites could be completely wrong. And they found that actually sometimes by saying nothing, is that the right thing? Do you make the business case or the fair case for innovation or resilience? Why do you have to make it for diversity?
That is interesting. And I've got to say, I'm surprised that such a large percentage is making the case at 85%. Because in a fascinating sense, I do think that corporations, by coming up and coming out in support of diversity and in support of a more fair and a more just organization, it's actually changing the way companies have employees that trust them. You and I touched on this, I don't know, a month or so ago, but for years now, we've seen a decrease in trust in companies. Matter of fact, in large organizations. But that's changing. And I actually think it's changing because companies are starting to focus on being more human. So have you, the math that you talked about, has that been your experience? Or don't you feel that we're having an impact on companies and that they are starting to get away from that math?
I think our experience, and today we work with about 300 organizations, and I have some great conversations, I've got to be honest. And I say to them all, I've had a conversation recently, True. I went on their website. I said, wow, it looks great. Looks great. And then I had a conversation with them. They said, oh, it's not quite the same here. The website was all very fair and very real and very human. You could argue it was in that 5%. And then they said, yeah, we don't live and breathe those values, and that's our issue. And it goes back to the website. The marketing department is completely not aligned with where the organization is as a culture. And so we see it day in, day out. It's people are, I suppose it does get a bit confusing, and I have to empathize with anybody who says, well, what should we do? Should we do this? Should we do that? We can't do right for doing wrong. I think it could be a little bit more simple. Why do you care about diverse talent? I care about it because I think it's amazing. It brings new perspectives. I just love learning from other people. It makes us an amazing team. And I deeply just care about people on a human level, not because it's going to fit a certain quota, not because it's going to do X, Y, Z for the business or our performance. And so it's a real challenging one. But one thing I've got to say, True, I can't argue with the stats and the numbers, and that's across all Fortune 500 organizations. 80% make the business case, and it's switching candidates off.
Interesting. Very, very good. You know what? Let's keep with the controversy, and I think I can connect a dot here. A lot of people are talking about one of the more controversial court cases that are coming before the Supreme Court. I think it's going to be in less than 4 weeks, October 31st, I think it's on the docket. And the court's going to address setting quotas on university campuses. And the issue, fascinating, isn't really whether the university's intentions are good. Intentions aren't the issues. So here's my twist. Tara, how do we create an environment where progress is measured, but we're still mindful of not instituting quotas?
But it is, and that's actually an interesting segue to what Gian just talked about, because I think maybe the point that he was raising is kind of to the counter of what you're asking me around setting targets and quotas. And let me start out by saying, one, thank you for having me here. So I'll jump in by saying that. And two, I don't think that quotas work. That being said, as business leaders, we would never start a year without understanding what our revenue goals are, what our objectives are. We would never open a new sales territory without understanding the competitiveness of the market or a projection of sales. Why? Right? Because people are motivated by objectives, especially those that are quantifiable. We all know the saying, we measure what matters, right? So then I guess to this point, after being in this industry for so long, being in this role for so many years, having a conversation that we're talking about with the Supreme Court, you have to wonder, why don't people take the same approach to people, right? We're talking about DEI in this particular case, we're talking about DEI in this particular question, we're talking about DEI in terms of the universities, but we can apply that standard to just any people-related aspect of employment. How do we have a group of people who are high potentials and not measure how many people get promoted? How do we have a group of high potentials and not care about how many people tried it in the year? We would never do that because data matters, right? And if you go back to just thinking about diversity overall, we also know that companies that emphasize diversity, the companies that are in the top quartile for ethnic and cultural diversity on executive teams, are somewhere in the realm of 33% more likely to be leading in profitability. We know that from a McKinsey study. We know that from many studies. Companies who have diverse organizations, companies who bring in diverse viewpoints, lead. Whether, I guess, Gian, to your point, they do that because we care about people, or whether we do that because bringing diverse background, values, kind of knowledge to the table makes us better, stronger, or more innovative. It allows us to think through areas that a group of people who all look alike, who have the same experiences, would never get to, right? So the question is, no one can argue the importance of understanding where you're trying to get to. No one can argue the importance of understanding what your market looks like and being able to ensure that what you do mirrors the market. What you can, and where companies, universities get in trouble, is how you go about doing it. You can get in trouble from just kind of from a legal perspective, where we are now, right? You can get in trouble for people feeling like you've now valued a group of people over me, so you don't want to go there. So it requires a holistic approach that's data driven, but it's inclusive, it's engaging, and it's inspiring. And it requires that the tone from the top says that creating a diverse and inclusive environment is a priority for me, Mr. CEO, Miss CEO. This is important for me. How do you go about doing that? Well, there's many things you can do. People started engaging in the Rooney Rule, which came from the NFL, that you have to have a diverse slate. It's important that you have a diverse slate. They started thinking about how do we broaden our sources. So we know that if you have a slate of people that has one person that's ethnically diverse, gender diverse, the likelihood of that person getting it is slim to none, because you take that one person, you compare them against everybody else, they lose. You add 2 people to a slate or 3 people to a slate, then you start having conversations that are not so much about what someone looks like, what their ethnicity is or their gender is, but you start to talking about people and how they're measured by their skill sets. So you can engage your recruiting sources. You can start going to HBCUs. You can start posting on Women Who Code. You can start kind of reaching out to Alpha, which is the Association of Latino Professionals. You can start doing pay equity studies, developing mentorship programs. I guess the answer, the long answer to, or the takeaways I would say to that question is, it is important to measure them. You don't have to have goals, but here's what you do need to do. You need to be, 1, clear. So what's your message? 2, intentional. 3, bold. 4, consistent. This is not the flavor of the day. It is the way that we operate. And 5, accountable. So if you have those things, quotas shouldn't be necessary because your goals are clear and your managers understand the imperative around diversity, equity, inclusion in the way that we just work overall.
Tara, I really like this, and I'm going to ask maybe Sue to give a different corporate insight in terms of how they operate within their management structure, because you talked about the clarity, bold, the intentional, and you mentioned at one point the message from the top down. We're talking about very large, complex organizations with thousands of people. How often do you get together? What is the management structure that allows these things not to be one person's view, but a collective? And how important is the CHRO versus a head of diversity? I'm curious about some sort of insight as to how does this become embraced by everyone on the management team, not just you're at the whim of a informed Renaissance CEO or not.
Yeah, Truett. Thanks for inviting me and having me here. It's great to be here with Gian and Tara. At the end of the day, it starts with the belief that in order to do our part globally in the global community, diversity, equity, and inclusion matters. Back to Gian's point from the beginning, it matters. It matters for a whole host of reasons, but it matters because at Liberty, we put people first. And therefore, it's important for us to be centered around that moral obligation. And then to Tara's point, we don't start our year either without thinking about our business outcomes and our goals and our objectives. And people are the way in which we do that. So we do like to have data that helps us understand one part of the equation. It isn't just the data that drives our decision, but it's part of it. And so you asked, Truett, I believe in your question, how does it actually work inside a corporate firm? And it starts at the top with it being important, being something that is as important as everything else that we do. And then you do need the operating rhythms, but the best organizations are the ones that are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of everything they do each and every day. It doesn't have to be on the agenda. It doesn't have to have a meeting every quarter, because at everything we do, it's been inculcated in the way in which we run our business. And then as a result of that, we get the outcomes that we want. We're not perfect. We're making huge progress, and we're very, very proud of where we are. But will always be dissatisfied as to where we are, because we should be better.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that you and I had a little bit of chat some time ago, and we talked about how the external environment and employee expectations have changed. And I think you actually made a statement where you felt that this was one of the most complex times to be a leader, and that our employees are expecting more. They're including connection and anticipating needs. And you made an observation. You said it's critical that we turn that into an advantage. What did you mean by that? And how are you doing that in your own business world?
Yeah, thanks for that, Truett. And I'll share a couple thoughts, but then I'll invite Tara and Gian to provide perspective, because I think it ties back to the earlier two questions. So I do believe personally, this is the most complex time to lead that I've been around. I think that the complexity of how we describe what makes people special and unique is broader than it's ever been. So it's not as simple as just understanding what may look like what makes me different may only be the tip of the iceberg of who I am. And so as a leader, it's not good enough to just appreciate what I would consider the fundamentals of diversity. It's really about creating that sense of belonging because you fundamentally care about the people with whom you have the privilege to be stewards of. And in order to do that, you've got to test yourself in ways you haven't before. And so I think, Tara, you were the one that said something around there has to be a sense of belonging in these 5 elements that are what's going to bring organizations forward. It's not easy to be clear, intentional, bold, consistent, and accountable. I mean, that's a lot to expect in every interaction when you layer that against all the uniqueness that sits across our organizations today and the evolving new variables. So I think the companies that figure out how to not just have it on their website, but how to make it feel that way the minute you interact with them, digitally or in person, because they can feel it in the questions you ask, in what you ask first, second, and third, in how leaders behave. And I think that's what's going to create the advantage. And so that's what we're trying to do along with many of our colleagues in and out of industry, is to create that sense of belonging so that person makes a choice to either join a firm or stay with a firm, not solely because of the bottom line and the profitability, but because they feel like they can make a difference and they feel like they're part of something bigger. So I'm curious, Gian, I know you mentioned, you can have all the words on the website, but how do you connect it? And I'm just curious your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, lots of thoughts. And I think on your first point, whilst it's a very complex time, I feel, to be a leader, I think it's also posing a very interesting opportunity for those leaders who want to lead the way in a very different way. And I think that, oftentimes I think being an effective leader and being a human leader, people have often seen them as mutually exclusive, and they're not. And actually the leaders who are getting it right are seeing that they're a necessary partnership, that you can, at the start of the year, hit the goals, drive the goals, but actually not just show you care, genuinely and deeply mean it about your people because they feel it. And I'm going to weave in extra layers here because there's 5 generations plus in the workforce. Gen Z are coming in and they want different things. They feel if leaders are being authentic and genuine. And if they don't like it, they're going to leave. And so I throw that out there because I think it's important. And the final thing, I feel like I'm getting really controversial on this panel, but I think it's an interesting topic, is something I read recently, that we can do all the work we want to create this culture of belonging, to make everybody feel accepted and it feels amazing. But it just takes one bad egg, or as I've read about them, toxic rock star. They're the people we all know, they drive the top line, they're bringing in the revenue, but they are awful for culture. And I say this because I think every organization needs to look at themselves and think, who might our toxic rock stars be? They might be the top billers, but they are certainly not driving this cultural agenda. And so at the top, whilst we're looking at revenue goals, but the quotas or the goals for diversity, inclusion, belonging, have we got the right players around the table? You mentioned around having the right league and people around us, and have an honest review about those rock stars and get them out.
Yeah, interesting. If I could, Gian, I'm going to actually come back to you on this because you've gone right up to the edge of an article I recently wrote. I read that said inclusion marketing versus inclusion reality. But I'm going to come back to that. All right. So hold the thought. And I want to segue for a second over to Tara. And interestingly, you should smile again because you are famous for storytelling. But I've gotten to know Tara a little bit, and she is a great storyteller, right? But at the heart of every story, there needs to be an event, a situation that they want to share. You talk about sharing it well. Well, Tara's got a vision. She tells wonderful stories. She's leading transformation. Tara, what was it in your past which influenced you so much in your thinking around D&I? What motivated you to get involved and be an advocate for change? And to be frank, if Sue, if you'd like to chime in after with your little bit of story, I'm curious about that moment or that event or that situation that kind of made you passionate about D&I.
Yeah, so I'm going to actually starting with a quote. So I'm not going to tell you a story, but I'm going to start with a quote, because as I was thinking about what I wanted to say here, I was trying to figure out how to kind of encapsulize why I think diversity is important to me. And so I'm actually going to turn to Angela Davis for a second. Angela Davis, wonderful professor now, someone who is from the 60s, one of our people who pushed things forward in the 60s. And one of the things that she said was, I'm no longer accepting the things that I can't change. I'm changing the things I can't accept. Right? Let's kind of just, like, that's just bold. I'm just going to change the things that I can't accept. And, for me, the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion just speaks to who I am and my background, oftentimes being one of the only in the room, so to speak. My parents did not come from a college education. They were immigrants to this country. And what we had was just the ability and the drive to move forward out of our situation. So let's look at how one does that, right? So why do we need to change things? Well, I'm a woman of color, so I'm kind of a double minority, actually maybe a triple minority. I'm a woman who's over 40 who is Black and a female, so that puts me that way. Right, well, yes, young, but still over 40, so that makes me old in some respects. I'm a young old person. But the statistics say that if you look at the Fortune 500 and how many people look like me that are CEOs, there are six. And let me give you a story about why that's profound and why people need to understand kind of how small that number is. Not long ago, I was at a previous firm. I was promoted to a very senior level of the organization. And one of the things that we did is we got the people who were promoted that year got us, everyone who was Black got we had a special dinner to honor us. And we were honored by the other Black senior leaders in the organization. I'm not going to give the numbers because they're not relevant, but let's suffice to say that a present that we got out of that dinner was a beautiful 5x7 picture frame that had the invitation framed, and it was signed by all the Black leaders in the organization. I loved it. But 5x7 signed by all the Black leaders. You know how big 5x7 is. So when the gift arrived at my office, I happened to have a woman, a close colleague of mine who was a white woman who was actually doing a lot of work related to diversity, happened to be in my office when the gift came. And she said, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, it's this frame that I got from the dinner that I went to, and all of the Black senior people in the organization signed it." And she said, "That's all of them?" Now, granted, this company was a kind of 60,000 person company, and all of the senior leaders signed this 5x7 frame. And the visual of that made her realize that although she was fighting for diversity, and she's a wonderful proponent of diversity, that she was not understanding the data and the intentionality of where we need to target some of our efforts. I could have said that in some way, but a picture says 1,000 words. And that picture and that 5x7 frame moved her to change, right? Mm-hmm. So just to kind of, but I want to just talk about numbers for a second here. So 1% of the Fortune 500 is Black, 4% are women, 4% are Hispanic, 5% of Asian. 85% of the Fortune 500 CEOs are white men. 85%. There's a huge disparity between what the lower or more junior rungs of the organization look like versus the most senior rungs. And I refuse to accept, to Angela Davis's point, that the majority of the people who come in who are underrepresented have a skill set that's different than the 85% of the people who are running corporate America. It's not true, right? And I know that because I look at my peers, I look at my mentees, and to make it more personal, my children, 2 Black boys who have every right to be a part of that upper echelon if that's what they want. And right now, I have 2 boys. There's 6 Black CEOs. The likelihood of both of them making it there, slim to none, because there's only 6 of them, right? So 2 of them coming from my family, probably not right. But not that it couldn't be, it just won't be, right? And then let's just say, to take it a little bit further, let's look at the 6 women, the 6 women, the 5 Black, or whatever the numbers are, and think about their travel to the top. It is lonely to be at the top. It is a scary place. And so let's think about the battles that they fought from a physical and mental toll, trying to fight past the 85% of people who believe that job is theirs, because when they look up, that's what it's supposed to look like. Imagine that, right? And so I guess the question back to what motivates me for change, or the story around change, is that we have to bring people along, but we have to bring people along and ensure that they understand that inclusivity is not just about belonging, but it's about making actionable efforts to make people feel comfortable, yes, because we want to go to work and feel comfortable, but giving people the opportunity to shine, to grow, the feedback for them to be corrective, and for someone to decide that I'm going to invest in you because others haven't invested in you, and bring them kind of forward.
Okay, it's very, very powerful, Tara, and thank you for sharing that. Gien and Sue, thinking about time a bit, what I'm going to ask is a quick one to you, Gien, and then a closing question to you, Sue, before we get to a kind of closing comments. And so if you could be sharp for a second, Gien, I think it's interesting what Tara just said does take me back to that inclusion marketing versus inclusion reality. Corporations increasingly have fantastic marketing teams that produce memorable, flashy, compelling websites that tell a wonderful story about the company's culture. Spin or reality, and doesn't make a difference. So the question is, how critical is it that there be symmetry? And are there any particular techniques that companies can use to close that gap? Try to keep this a little bit sharp, because I want to go to Sue, and then I want each of you to be able to make some closing comments.
No problem. I'll keep it sharp, keep it sweet. I think, to your 2 points, if you have a shiny website that looks amazing with loads of diverse talent, and then somebody joins there and they don't feel a sense of belonging, because guess what? The reality doesn't look like the website. No matter how hard you're trying, people leave. And it's a waste of everybody's time and money. So what I say to organizations is just be real and be intentional. Who are you and who you are not? Don't have a website that doesn't represent who you are and who you want to be, because people will I was on one recently, an amazing website. I said, I'd love to join here, to be honest. Spoke to them. They said, you know what? Our marketing team, top class. The rest of the organization, huge way to go. So to keep it concise, what can we do? Genuinely, what can we do to bridge that gap? I think organizations do need to be intentional. Who are you and who are you not? And look at where you are right now and where you want to be. I think there's a bit of a gap analysis there. And then notice that, culture's an ever evolving journey. And what we need to do is drive the narrative. Now, my big way that I genuinely believe you can change the narrative and the way employees think, feel, and behave at work is through storytelling. Now, we've just heard here from Tara's own story. I can sit and reel you off facts, but I'll also remember Tara's 2 sons. And so the point is that if we can use the power of storytelling of the people of our organizations, number one, but also as a communication tool to drive forward the culture we're trying to create, it is incredibly powerful. And a lot of the work today we've done with AXA, Allianz, etc. So storytelling, don't underestimate it. Make sure that our websites are clear of who we are.
Okay, well, perfect. To wrap up this section of the interviews, we are all navigating a changing environment where, no question, inclusion is more complex than ever. So how do leaders model the way and I don't know, create the space to learn, to be curious, to understand that part of the process is that we might not always get it right. And indeed, we don't get it right a lot of the time. Being vulnerable is part of growth. How do leaders model that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this intersection of courage and vulnerability is something I discovered way too late in my career. So when anyone always asks me, what's the one piece of advice you'd give, which I kind of really dislike that question generally, Truett, so thanks for not asking me that one. But I always say courage and vulnerability. The sooner you can understand that vulnerability is courage, that accepting that you've done something wrong is the best way to launch you forward in learning, the sooner you're going to achieve whatever it is that's set out for you to achieve. And so as it relates to the topic we're talking about here is, if we believe that it's a complex environment, if we believe Guillaume's point that it might be complex, but it really shouldn't be that hard to solve, and we should be courageous, then the sooner we understand that we need to ask questions, that we need to be curious. When we don't get something right, we call people into the conversation. We explain our perspective in a way that gives them new language, that makes them comfortable to send that message forward. But if we're afraid to have a conversation because we're afraid I'm going to use the wrong words when I'm talking to Tara or Tara's talking to me, then we've lost before we've started. But if we're courageous enough to ask because we want to learn and we want to understand. I was asked to be the senior advisor of the Black African Americans and Allies community at a prior firm. I'm brown, but I present white. I have 3 boys that present white. I had no idea. So my first part was getting a few people together and letting them tell me their stories and being able to have a venue where I could ask questions and be unafraid of how that question would come forward, because it was truly coming from a place of grace and a place of a desire to make a difference, but I couldn't do that till I understood. So my ask for everyone and my offer everyone is the sooner you can get comfortable with courage and vulnerability, I'm sure you will achieve far more than you could ever anticipate.
Wow, I love the answer, Sue. And the fact that I'm going to ask everybody to make closing remarks, those would be great, but that shouldn't preclude you from coming yet with something else. To wrap this up, I'd like to turn to each of you, ask you that you do either by summarizing your own comments or by dealing with something that's been triggered by something someone else has said. Let's kind of keep it to a minute. Let's start with you again, and then Tara, and then Sue, bring us home.
Sure, mine's very different to what I thought I was going to share, because actually it's to say to everyone, don't underestimate the power of your story and the impact it can have on those around you and your organization internally and also as your brand outside. I think hearing from Sue today, Tara, and even you, Truett, everybody's got a story, and storytelling doesn't make any of us less professional. It just makes us more human. So let's go out, as Tara said, get curious, listen to people's stories, listen to understand, not to respond. And I genuinely believe will make the workplace a lot more human for tomorrow.
Great. Thank you again. Tara.
Yeah, and I love that answer. I am just going to say that we all need to decide who we want to be and what role we want to play. And I recognize that people are at different points in the spectrum. And so some are more self-actualized. Some of them are still trying to figure out, what does diversity mean? Why is it important? And what does it do to me? Let's face the reality that there's people who are scared by it, right? If we have more diversity, then where do I fit into that? Whatever the case is, I think to get started, we have to understand and create a North Star. And then once you have that North Star, either do what Sue did, is try to figure out, why is that different than everyone else is going, and understand some stories, because maybe you just haven't had access, you don't know, maybe you don't know the data, maybe you don't know the people. Or if you have a North Star and you're clear on the North Star as being diversity, equity, inclusion, then start to figure out what are some of the actions that you need to take to inculcate that into your organization at the senior most level. Or, by the way, diversity, equity, inclusion happens at all levels. So those people, Sue, that you talked to on that panel, they're doing it too. So just figure out what you want to be and then take some actionable steps to get there.
Terrific. Thank you, Tara. Sue, as I said, bring us home.
Thanks. Well, thanks again for having us all here. I guess I'm going to offer something different than I had expected to, just based on listening to my colleagues. I would say just keep it simple. Do one thing. When I left last night to drive to Boston, my 16-year-old son, I have 3, Tara, so we should talk someday about boys. And I say to him what I say to them every time I say goodbye, which is, do something for someone else tomorrow. Just do something for someone else tomorrow. And if you keep it that simple and you elevate it based on the role you play and the work you do, if I stop thinking about myself and I start thinking about someone else, by default, I'm already 60% of the way there. So I would say, if anything from what we talked about today spoke to you, take that spoke to you and do something for someone else with it. And if you do that, every day will be a great day.
So that's fabulous. And I want to start by thanking all 3 of you. I think this has been wonderful. In many ways, we've started, and the premise was companies and corporations, but including the statements by all 3 of you in your wrap-ups, this is very, very personal. I hope that in an audience that you found a nugget, you found something that you want to change in your own organization. You've got a question for your executive team. You've got a question for your head of diversity or DEI with your CHRO, that it's provoked a little bit deeper thought about how you can approach tomorrow differently. And in so doing, move the needle, make your company a better place. We make the world a better place. So I thank all of you. This has been spectacular. IIS, thank you for giving us the opportunity to be with this audience, and to the audience, thank you for your time and your thought and your engagement.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, Truett, for leading us through that incredible conversation around inclusion. I myself am still reeling and thinking about all the things I heard and the great takeaways that I'm going to bring back to my company and my life. I think that our companies are going through transformation right now in a number of ways. Our world is not easy to navigate, and this inclusion conversation is important, but it can be hard to understand how to get into it. And I think that our panelists have given us some unique keys. I have been a part of a lot of panels, and I haven't heard some of the perspectives that we heard today. Some of my key takeaways are being authentic as a company. There's bravery in that, right? You're on a journey and you have to be real about where you are on that journey. But at the same time, your culture has to be intentional. And you can build that culture through storytelling, but not just storytelling, but through listening to the stories of your employees and your customers. They can be powerful. I love when Tara said that we're going to change the things we cannot accept. I like to tell a story around how my father, I'm a first generation American. My father, coming in from Jamaica, navigated corporate America before me. And I always thank him for showing me where the obstacles were. And he gave me all these tools around how to get around them and what to do. And while I thank him for that, our generation and the generation under ours is very much about moving the obstacles. They don't belong there. So we're not going to do more things to get over obstacles that don't belong there. The conversation needs to switch around what we really need to do to make things actually have a lasting change. And finally, we measure what matters, right? But maybe not through a quota. I love this conversation about the perspective of measurements. Not a quota, but yeah, we should have goals, just like you do in your regular conversations around other business imperatives, right? And I think thinking about the structure and foundation of your company, DEI should not be its own pillar, but rather it should sit within every single pillar that you have. And I think being vulnerable and courageous at the same time is a really powerful combination, because leading through curiosity can take us to really, really great new heights. One thing that I will be using from now on, and I will be using it a lot, is the conversation around toxic rock stars. Because while you're trying to make a change to the organization, you may have really high performers based on a former iteration of what your culture is and what it's going to be. They cannot survive. Your culture cannot survive if they survive. And what I'm saying by that is that we really should be looking at how we can make sure the conversation is permeating all levels and all kinds of employees. It's not just for those in the lower level. It's not just for the executives. It's a part of a new culture, a new conversation. And so I implore you to do what our panelists said we should do, which is just do something for someone else today. And I think we're going to pass it on and move on to the next conversation after this. Thank you so much for joining. I'm definitely going to rewind, as I will other conversations during this conference. Let's get into the next conversation. See you next time.